Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I am so excited that you are joining me today. We met at CPC in 2022 at the Lifeway Hi-Fi booth, and it was so fun to get to meet you and your wife and just hear more about your ministry. And then we ended up writing together for Hi-Fi at one point, which was super fun to collaborate on some of that. And we've just been social media friends, doing all the fun things and just cheering each other on social media. And so I'm so excited that you are finally on the podcast. There's a really specific reason I wanted you to be on the podcast, which I'm going to let you share a little bit of your story first, and then I'll kind of share about that. But why don't you start by just introducing yourself, telling us about who you are, your kids' ministry experience, your family, all the fun things.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Well, my name is Matthew Haines. I've been married to my wife, Ansley, for 5 years. We live in the upstate of South Carolina. We've lived here for a little over 4 years, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend an out-of-state move for the first year of marriage, but it is what we did. And at the end of it, it definitely brought us closer together. We have an incredible community that we've formed here, and that's been so awesome. I currently serve as the support pastor at Springwell Church up here. Which is a recent move for me after a decade of serving in children's ministry, but getting to kind of step to the other side and get to champion not only the leaders here, but children's ministry abroad while I kind of live in an administrative role is a exciting space to step into. But I've loved and championed family ministry for a very, very long time. And just think that what family ministry leaders create is so pivotal and can really make or break a church experience for any particular guest. So still definitely a big champion of that and love conversations like these. And then also, very importantly, my wife and I are foster parents. That's been a huge part of both of our stories. My parents were also foster parents, so I've been in that realm for most of my life, almost as long as I can remember. And so I knew from a really early age that was something that I would want to be a part of as an adult. And what was crazy is as I met my wife and as we started dating, realized she had a very similar experience. And so we've pretty much always known that being foster parents was an important goal of ours, but figuring out when and God's timing in that was definitely important, and making sure that he opened all the correct doors for when we were ready and prepared for that, as ready and prepared for it as we could be.
Yes.
And that kind of happened all at about this time last year. So we've had our home open for about a year. We had one respite placement that stayed with us for a weekend, and then shortly after, the sibling group that we have now moved into our home. So we've got 2 sisters, 8 and 14, that moved in about a year ago, and then their brother moved in December of last year. So we went from 0 to 60 very quickly, from no kids in the house to an 8-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 15-year-old. And that is
goodness.
Just the craziness that we are living right now, but we really truly love it, and are always honored to get to use what we're learning to love on other people.
Yeah, that's awesome. So this is originally why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because this is coming out the first Wednesday of May, and May is National Foster Awareness Month. And I always love to talk about foster care and foster parents and just what this looks like in the kids ministry space every May, because kids ministry leaders are often at the forefront of partnering with parents as they're
100%.
entering into foster care, as they're participating. They're the first ones to maybe have a kid on Sunday morning come into their class for the first time. And there's so much newness of like, maybe these kids have never been to church before, but they're in this new home, this new place, and now they're going to a new church. And I think we were in community with some families who were participating in foster care for a season, and just not only the needs alone, but the detailed of only certain people could watch the kids.
Yep.
And so like you have to be background checked and fingerprinted. And our church had a program that was like a parents' night out. And so we offered a safe space for foster care kids to drop their kids off. Everyone was fully approved, and they had passed all the things that they needed so that these foster care parents could get a couple hours to do whatever they really needed. And sometimes that was just taking a nap in the car. And so I knew from your story, I was like, Matthew's going to be the perfect one to be on the podcast, is to share his experience, not only from a kids ministry staff perspective, but from a foster parent perspective. And so I kind of would love for you to start answering this like really general question of how can the church partner with foster families inside the church, but also for those foster families who may be in the community, who may not know that your church is doing X, Y, and Z to make it a safe space for foster families to go into that church.
I think I would start by, first of all, affirming something that I've noticed, because as I've attended conferences and listened to podcasts like this, what I'm sensing in the kids ministry community is that as a whole, people are leaning in and trying to figure out, okay, we have kids in our community, in our churches, that we would consider vulnerable. Yeah. And we want to figure out what we can do to love on them the best that we can. And so I just want to affirm how great that is, that just the fact that leaders are willing to lean in and ask that question, because I think that God does honor it when we lean into those moments. And I just think that before you know it, you'll turn around and you'll be connecting with families that find themselves in the midst of that. And if you're already in a place of open-handedness, beautiful things can happen from that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But my best advice for a church leader trying to figure out what they can do to love on foster families is to have a conversation with one. I would be shocked to hear if your church doesn't have any in its midst or somebody that they know that's currently walking through that wouldn't be willing to sit down and have a conversation and talk about what their reality is, what they are facing, what they do hope for, what they pray for, what they wish others would pray for. Because the reality is all those stories are so different. I recently had lunch with somebody who is a foster dad, but they have a 2-year-old and a baby, and their experience is wildly different than what Ansley and I are currently experiencing, and their needs are wildly different than the needs that Ansley and I have. And that's so typical of general parenting too, that as you navigate different phases of the kids in your home, your needs and your prayers are going to look different. But I would start there. I would just be open to having that conversation of leaning in, of becoming just a prayer warrior for the things that break the hearts of the foster families in your community. But also taking advantage of the connections that they've probably already made. One thing that's really incredible about the onboarding process for foster families, especially foster families that partner with a private agency, is that they'll do a really great job of connecting you with clothes closets and parent night outs and support groups to make sure that you as a family have what you need. And so they will likely have connections right in your backyard that you as a church can partner with. One of the cool things that I love that our church has done is that every time we have a time change Sunday, we do a pajama day, which I've seen lots of churches do. It's very, very common to do a pajama day on time change Sunday. Kids love an opportunity to show up on a Sunday morning in their pajamas. And what our church has done is encourage families not only to show up, not only to let their kids show up in their pajamas, but also to bring a new pair of pajamas that we then donate to a local partner in the community that goes directly to a foster closet. And so what I've noticed that does is twofold. A, it's a direct partner we're giving to a need in our community. But also I've seen families that were not aware of this closet existing that have formed partnerships outside of Sunday mornings. And I've heard feedback from foster families of how seen they feel on those 2 Sundays a year when their church family calls attention to what they're doing. And simply by being recognized and appreciated for what they do, it's a game changer for a foster family that's sitting amongst the rest of your families on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, that is so brilliant. Like adding that missions component to like a fun Sunday is so smart. And pajamas, for the most part, you go to Target, pajamas aren't very expensive. And you can pick up, and sometimes they come in like sets of 3. And you're like, here's 3 sets of pajamas that you can give to another child. And I think that creates a really, really incredible way to say being generous doesn't have to be just giving money. Yes, that's important, but being generous can also be doing something fun. Like going and picking out pajamas is a fun thing that the whole family can participate in. And I think that's just so smart. And it isn't necessarily like a lot of churches have a set of like, oh, these are our ministry partners that we donate to and do all these things with. And you could pick something like that it doesn't have to be something new, but like adding the missions element doesn't have to be complicated.
Right.
And I think that
it was as simple as like putting out a sign, a social media post, and then a laundry basket in our lobby that day.
Yeah. That's so smart. I love that idea. I think that's really helpful. Now, I didn't even talk about this at the beginning after you told your story, but I'm baffled that you now have 2 teenagers in your house. Like
it's wild.
People, like typically it's like, oh, we have a baby, then we do toddlers, preschool, elementary school. You have like 10 years with that child to prepare for the teenage years.
Yes.
And you went straight into the teenage years. And so I want you to speak on just a little bit as like a dad perspective, because kids ministry looks very different than student ministry. Yes. And so how has this been for you as a foster parent partnering with the student ministry who is really is their opportunity to come alongside you as you are housing, fostering, loving on teenagers?
Yeah. Well, I have to say it's definitely brought me and our family pastor who leads our student ministry closer together. And really, without me saying anything, I've watched as he's done a brilliant job of welcoming in the kids in our home to what happens in student ministry at Springwell. Because the reality is, especially by the time that foster kids are teenagers, this is true of kids too, but especially by the time that they become teenagers, they're really looking for normalcy.
Yeah.
Because so much of their life is being constantly reminded that their life doesn't look like other kids that they hang out with. When they have a caseworker that visits at school, or when they have to do a visitation with a family member, or when they have to do extra therapy appointments, they just are constantly put up with reminders of, oh yeah, my life is not normal. Yeah. And so what was huge for me was really watching what our student ministry does best, which is welcoming every kid the same. And that at that moment on Sunday evenings when they showed up to student ministry, it really didn't matter what their family looked like. It didn't matter what appointments they had that week. They were a normal teenager just like everybody else in the room. And that was huge for me, but also huge for them, especially the teenage girl in our house. We've watched as she has made connections with other girls at student ministry that she messages with during the week. They play Fortnite together. They're doing life as teenagers together. And it's the most normal that I ever see her. When she's surrounded by those friendships that she's formed at student ministry. So I would just say, especially when it comes to student ministry, connecting with foster families, what you're doing, the way that you invite students in, just keep doing that, because that is exactly what those foster teens are looking for.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I love that she's finding community and building friendships and feeling seen and known and like doing all the, like you said, normal teenage things, like chatting during the week and playing games and doing all the normal things and seeing that the church is a safe place for them where.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely changed my perspective of this space. Because I think especially when it was just my wife and I, it was way easier for me to just view the space as my job, which I know is not ideal. It's something that we as ministry leaders work against all of the time. But once you bring kids into it, that challenges it so fast because if you view it as your job only, that is how your kids are going to view it too. I was at a conference recently where I told a story about how our 8-year-old showed up to children's ministry and kind of had a little bit of an emotional breakdown in a small group setting at one point, just as she was processing through some emotions. And honestly, her small group leader did a brilliant job of walking her through that and allowing her to bring those emotions in the room. And I found myself dealing with this tension of, okay, whoa. You remember I'm the one that brought you in here. Like, we got to be careful about the kinds of things that we talk about in small groups. But I'm so glad that I felt convicted of that quickly and never had that conversation with her because in that moment I watched and realized that as she was processing those emotions, there was a part of her that was also realizing this is a safe place for me to do that. Yeah. And really that's what I hope most children's ministry leaders are hoping for all their kids, that they're creating spaces for emotional breakthroughs, for hope to be found. And that was happening in real time for me. And it was a game changer for how I viewed this space.
That's so good. Let's talk about volunteers for a little bit because a kids ministry leader may have the tools and resources to engage with a foster family, but sometimes volunteers don't know and they don't know what to say. And a lot of times churches who have volunteers who maybe don't serve every week and are often on the schedule, they show up and they have no idea that this child is a foster child. And so how do you equip your volunteers to tread lightly and just be aware? Like, how do you communicate like, oh, this is like, do you even communicate this child? This is a snippet of their story that might be helpful for you as you lead them in small group. Do you communicate that? Do you train them? What does that look like?
That's a great question. And I think with so much of what we do in children's ministry, this is true, but consistency is key. And training our leaders on language is key. Because honestly, what I've found to be the most helpful is simple changes in the language that we use. And really making that a standard across the board. So that way, when kids in vulnerable situations do show up on a Sunday morning, that their standard is true for everybody else that's walking in too. Yeah. And what I mean when I say that, the best example I can give is trying not to use general terms like mom and dad. Like even as simple as checkout is happening and looking at your kids and saying, okay, mom, your moms and dads are on your way. Because that can be incredibly damaging to a child that hasn't seen their mom or dad in months or weeks.
They're like, really? Are like, it's like, that's a true thought of like, are they?
Exactly. Are they? Really? She's coming here? Yeah. And so changing that dialogue to, hey, your adults are on your way, or I do think it's okay to even say parents, because we found that the kids in our home refer to us as parents pretty often. They're comfortable with the term parent, less so than the terms mom and dad.
Interesting.
I know that's been, and I've found that that's true across the board more than I would have expected. Yeah. But just being careful about those terms that we use from stage and at check-in and at checkout. As far as their stories are concerned, one thing that is hammered home for us as foster parents is the anonymity that our foster kids have the right to, because of the vulnerable parts of their story, that at the end of the day, it's their story that they get to hold. And we as the foster parents don't have the right, nor should we, of sharing that with people that they may not be comfortable knowing. And so what my rule of thumb is I will have conversations with those adults that are doing drop off. And typically as we're wrapping up those conversations, I'll look at them and I'll say, can you let me know what pieces of that you're comfortable with me sharing with their leaders?
Yeah.
And my advice to you in that is, as you're letting me know what you're comfortable with me sharing, is let me know what would be the most helpful as we seek to love this child well.
Yeah.
Which doesn't often mean we need to know pieces of the story, but could be helpful to know she doesn't do well with bright lights or loud sounds, or she struggles with physical touch. And being able to look at that leader and say, hey, it's really not my story to share, but just letting you know that as you're inviting this child in, these are some triggers that you might want to look out for, some things that you might want to avoid, so that we are loving her to the best of our ability.
Yeah. Gosh, that's so helpful. And I have heard the term a lot of it's their story to tell. And there's so much truth in that. And I love even the question of how much of this are you comfortable in me sharing? And I feel like even as kids get older, that's a question that you could even ask the kids of like, how much do you want to share with the adults in your classroom or the volunteers? And can I share this? Asking permission or certain things like that. And then for the volunteer, equipping them, it's what are the need to know things that 100%. Are going to help this child thrive in the classroom. And I think a lot of that is relational, of like, here's how you can build a relationship that then leads to more of the story being shared. Like the physical touch is a really great example of, hey, they're not going to, for the littles, it's like, hey, they're not going to sit on your lap when you read a story, or they're not going to do X, Y, and Z. And just allowing, I think sometimes what can get tricky is sometimes volunteers are like, oh, no, they'll be fine. We'll figure it out. And you kind of have to lay down the law is a really aggressive term that I wouldn't use. But it is this reality of like, teaching your volunteers and creating the culture across your volunteers of like, hey, if this is a value of ours to care for the vulnerable in our community, so that's kids with special needs, that's kids who are in foster care, then we have to take these stipulations and these personal, unique aspects of these kids seriously.
And I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, because I think it's a constant vision casting of if this is at the core of who we are, then it does impact what we do day to day on a Sunday. Yeah. And I do remind volunteers of that pretty regularly. Like, hey, because of the people that we serve, this is the information I'm going to share with you, just like I would hope you would do the same for me. That if you have a new child in your room and you learn those things about them, and you know that the volunteers that serve opposite of you would benefit from knowing that, I would hope that you would share that with me, so that way we can communicate it across the board to love that child well.
Yeah, it's just like you put allergy things on a name tag. It's like, that's very similar of like, well, okay, we're not going to give this child nuts or peanut butter because that's not going to help them thrive in this environment. And so I think being careful with what you share and how you share it. And I think that's a beautiful way of honoring the child. Because I think when we talk about like caring for people and caring for kids, and everyone's made in the image of God and being image bearers, like everyone has a story. And just because they're 5 doesn't mean that you, the kids ministry leader, the foster parent, the volunteer, has the right to know the 5-year-old story, because maybe they just don't know how to communicate it well. Just like you wouldn't go and share an adult story that's personal to them. Like, I think it's a frame of reference that we often don't have for kids.
Yes.
And it's an important reminder. I think that's really helpful. So those are all really good things. From a foster dad perspective, what do you wish the church knew about foster care? Or what do you wish, like obviously you were the kids director, like you were leading the ministry, so you obviously set some visions in place. But if you were to go to the church across the city with your family, it's like, what do you wish somebody knew as you and your family walked into that church for the first time?
It's such a good question, and there's so many different ways I could walk through that. But I think most importantly, I would want people to recognize that what we've chosen to do is hard. There was a conversation that my wife and I had very early on, where we processed through, okay, by saying yes to this calling, we are agreeing to walk through some form of grief. Yeah. Because at the end of our time with this child, or at the end of the case, I should say, we are either going to be grieving their time with us, or we're going to be grieving the life that they walked away from. Gosh, and that's a heavy thing, to be accepting a calling that guarantees grief.
Yeah.
And so I would want churches to be aware that it is a heavy burden to carry, and to recognize that and appreciate that in them, to be prayer warriors alongside of them. But at the same time, we don't do it to be heroes. We're not trying to put ourselves on a pedestal. I think foster parents that are trying to do that will get chewed up and spit out of the process, because they won't survive in it. So it's not our goal to be the heroes of your church. It is our goal to be advocates for the kids that have entered our homes. And so for church leaders to be sensitive of the conversations that we have, of the things that we request, of the things that burden us, of the emotions that we walk into the space with, just due to the nature of what it is that we're doing.
Yeah. Wow, that's so good. That's such a good reminder, even for me, who's not on staff somewhere, but like are engaging with foster families, that grief is both. It's like, you're going to do this anyways. Like it's a both and whether, I think before I engaged with foster families, I didn't really think about the grief side of what the child is walking away from. I just didn't think about it. You think of all these happy ending stories of they've been adopted, like it's a happy ending. And the more and more I've learned and grown as a human in this area it is hard. It is sad. It is like,
no matter what,
it's like you want these kids to be with the parents who created them, and like, but it's a sad story for them that somewhere in their story they were not chosen.
Yes.
And there's grief there. And I think I've learned that side of foster care, not personally, but just through being in community with other foster families, that like no matter what the outcome is, whether they're unified back again with the bio parents or they're adopted into a new family, like there is so much grief in that story, and there can be so much joy, right? We can hold both of those things.
Absolutely.
And so,
living in both places.
Yes. And so as you think about that, I think that's really, really helpful for the church leader. Do you have any like tangible resources? Like this has been really helpful for us, or this book or this podcast. Is there anything like that you have found that kids ministry leaders can recommend, or kids ministry leaders can read themselves?
There's actually a podcast that's it's pretty recent. It's kind of coming off the ground right now, but I've found to be one of the most helpful tools that I've been processing, and it's by a woman called Nicole Barlow, and her podcast is called Foster Parent Well. Okay. And she interviews current foster parents, health experts, former foster parents, foster trainers. She does a great job of kind of walking through every facet of what it is that foster parents will walk through, and the joys of it and the hard parts as well.
Yeah.
And I would say that she is an incredible resource because what she does is she combines with the importance of walking through foster care with a gospel mentality, with an overall health vision for the foster parents as well. Are you emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally healthy as you're walking these kids with trauma through life?
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. We'll link those in the show notes so that people can find them. But any type of resources are always really helpful. Just learn. I think for me, not similar to your story. I didn't grow up. My parents were not foster parents. We didn't have a lot of foster families that I knew of in Southern California where I grew up. And so when I entered into just the ministry world, I just was like, I have so much to learn in this space. And so I think anytime a kids ministry leader can learn and grow in an area, they should, it's a good learning opportunity to be like, how can I do this better? How can I care for our families better and be in our community better? So thanks for those resources.
Absolutely.
You kind of touched on talking about the podcast, talking about from a gospel perspective. And I would love to know, since becoming a foster parent, how has your view of the gospel or your understanding of the gospel changed since entering into this new role?
I think the thing that's changed the most is something that we talk about in children's ministry all the time, which is that what Jesus gave was a gift for all people. And I think that's a beautiful thing that we say and that we talk about. But the reality of that is incredibly heavy, because standing on this side of the vulnerable stories that I carry, it is incredibly easy for me to villainize members of these kids' biological families or other adults that have come in and out of their lives, and to just live in this place of blame and shame. And the reality and what God hits me with more often than I would like him to is that the gospel was a gift to them just as much as it was a gift to me. And allowing myself to live in a place of grace and softness towards the people that I would rather live in blame for. Because the reality is, if you've got kids with trauma, it started probably with a relationship with an adult that didn't go the way it was supposed to. And the reality of God loving that adult just as much as he loves that child is so hard. And it's something I struggle with on a daily basis. But if I don't process through that and allow God to wash that grace over me, then I don't have the softness that I need to have for the adults that these kids still have relationships with.
Yeah. That's such a good reminder. That's so good and so helpful. Even from a kids ministry leader perspective, it's easy to jump on the villainizing bandwagon. And for a kids ministry leader, because you just never know, those biological parents could walk in that church building. You just have no idea.
And sometimes they do.
And so it is that daily reminder of I am as undeserving as they are.
Yes.
And the gospel is for them. Just like you said, the gospel is for them just as much as it is for me. And Jesus came to save all people. And I think that's such a good reminder. And just the willingness to have a soft heart, because I bet in the foster care world, it's really easy to have a hard heart towards other parents and humans and just the system. And there's so many judges and caseworkers, and there's so many people that are involved in all the processes. And to just continue to pray for a soft heart, and for the kids ministry leader to pray for that, to pray for that for the parents and be a reminder to them, I think is a really sweet way to come alongside the parents. So to think about tangible needs, obviously, we kind of talked about the differences between foster families with babies and toddlers who are they just need boxes of diapers and clothes and formula and all of those things. But as you think about kind of foster families in general, what are some tangible ways that the church can come alongside foster families that are in their church?
So one thing that I think a lot of people don't process, which makes sense because it's so far out of the realm of normalcy for many people, is the process of welcoming a new child into your home for the first time. And I think we as a church, we as a network of churches, I think do such a great job of rallying around newborns and the families of newborns and coming alongside of them and providing for their needs and making sure that they know that they're not in this alone. And I think what I would love to see more of holistically at churches is the same sort of treatment for a foster family that welcomes in a new placement, because the reality is in many ways it's just as tough. Because you're figuring out an entire new human in your house in the blink of an eye. And sometimes they're walking and talking on cell phones and saying words that you don't normally say in your house, and and figuring out all of those things and figuring out what normal looks like for every member of that family is hard. That initial transition is incredibly hard. And it would be a game changer if somebody from the church showed up and said, hey, what you're walking through is hard, and I can't imagine, and I'm praying for you, and these are the things I'm praying over you. And also, here's a lasagna. Dinner is covered. Don't worry about that. Really, at any point in the foster journey, I don't know of a foster family that would say no to a free meal. Just because caseworker visits are hard and court dates are hard. And for someone to say, hey, I recognize the weight that you are carrying right now, and though I can't take that away from you, I can step into this practical need and give that to you. So I would say meals are a big deal. I think time for the foster parents to spend together is huge. Because I know you touched on this at the very beginning, but childcare is hard for us. We are in a weird spot because we do have teenagers in the home, and the teenagers can stay by themselves, but per the way that their case is written, they cannot watch their younger sister. So we have
interesting.
And so we have an 8-year-old that we can't leave at the house with her siblings. And so what's been really cool is we do have people in our church community who have stepped up and said, hey, what do I need to do? What do I need? What paperwork do I need to fill out? Because you and your wife need to have a date night. That's important. If you guys don't stay connected, then what you're doing doesn't matter. And so what can we do to make sure that you have the tools you need to continue to pour into your relationship? And that, I mean, I tell those people as often as I can is I can never put into words how thankful I am for that. Yeah,
that's awesome. I love that. And it's like you just went from feeding 2 people in your house to feeding 5 people in your house, which is like which is just like that's a learning curve in general, because you're like, we're cooking for 2 and now we're cooking for 5, and 2 of them are teenagers and like eating you through house and home and like
all the time.
It's like, let me just deliver a Costco order of snacks. Like I just can't imagine.
Yes. Yeah, my wife sometimes looks at me and I'm like, hey, do we have any leftovers from that dinner? She's like, no, I cooked 12 servings and it's all gone. I don't know how.
Oh my goodness, that's so funny. Well, Matthew, the last question we always ask is if you were talking to someone who is brand new in kids ministry, and this is like general kids ministry, so using all your kids ministry wisdom, if you were talking to someone brand new in kids ministry, what would be your words of encouragement or advice?
I would say that God designed us to be people of community. And the most beautiful things I've seen come out of any ministry context are done in community. And so not to forget to surround yourself with people that are aligned with the vision that God's given you. Because if you try to walk in and do children's ministry by yourself, that is the enemy's favorite thing. Because he can just fill your head with the lies that surround all of your insecurities in ministry if there are not people there to remind you of the truth. Yeah. So connect yourself with other children's ministry leaders that aren't at your church. Connect yourself with volunteers that you trust, that you can allow them to feel that burden alongside of you. Connect yourself with families who are at the receiving end of what you're creating, and allow them to speak truth and light over you so that you can do this for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. Good words of encouragement and wisdom. Matthew, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was truly a joy to have you.
I loved being here. Thank you so much.